Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Before Winchester woke, a quiet backstreet on Westside Drive was already part of an investigation. A rear window failed sometime near dawn. By early evening, officers entered the same single-family home for a welfare check and found two adults inside, deceased. Between those points sits the spine of this case, a narrow window of time, a forced entry, and a protection order signed the day before. This chapter fixes the anchors so nothing drifts later. Friday, October 17, 2025. Predawn activity is reconstructed at roughly 5 a.m., based on what the room and the clock allowed investigators to verify. The home's backyard is partially shielded. The rear window shows disturbance consistent with an entry route rather than an exit. Inside, first responders secure the perimeter, freeze the weapon on scene, and split tasks, photographs, measurements, shell casing placements, and a walkthrough to mark where each body was found. Children are accounted for elsewhere, which tightens the timeline and removes additional victims from the immediate risk domain. The evening call isn't drama, it's logistics. A concerned party requests a welfare check around 6:30 p.m. Patrol makes entry, clears the structure, then holds for detectives and the medical examiner's team. Notifications follow protocol. The bodies are scheduled for transport to Frankfurt for autopsy, where muzzle-to-target distance, trajectory, and residue patterns will be confirmed under standard state procedures. Those results will matter later. For now, what's locked is simple: 1 residence, 2 decedents, no pursuit, no second scene. Context matters, but only what's documented. The day before the homicide, a domestic violence order was granted to protect the woman who lived here. Orders create legal boundaries, they don't provide physical guardianship. Enforceability depends on contact, proximity, and reporting. In practice, the first hours after an order issues can be higher risk. That is not speculation, it is a pattern repeatedly flagged by victim advocacy professionals and police. We avoid conjecture about motive in this phase. Instead, we focus on what the structure tells us. Glass on interior flooring indicates inward break. Frame damage suggests prying force at the sash, not a simple latch failure. Path of travel from the rear window to a back bedroom is short. There is no evidence of ransacking or prolonged search. A single close-range discharge is apparent at the primary scene. Another gunshot is documented elsewhere inside the residence. The weapon remains on site. Chain of custody is logged for ballistics and latent prints. Digital extractions, phones, doorbells, neighboring cams, are queued after warrants. If the timeline feels too clean, that is the note investigators write in their heads: the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. But clean data beats no data. The next chapters test each point: entry mechanics, ballistic sequencing, and what devices near Westside Drive saw, or didn't, between 4:45 and 5:15 a.m. Ava Brentley was 35, a Winchester mother with a routine built around work, school schedules, and keeping 4 kids' lives moving. Friends describe her as steady and practical. That is all we need at this stage: no mythology, just a person who lived inside the house on Westside Drive. 24 hours before the homicide, a Kentucky court granted a domestic violence protective order in her favor. It set legal distance and no contact terms. It did not place a patrol car in her driveway. Viewers sometimes expect that it does. It never has. The order matters because it timestamps risk. When a court signs one, it means recent conduct met a legal threshold. Service of the order notifies the respondent. From that point, any approach, call, message, or appearance at the protected address turns criminal. On paper, leverage shifts toward the victim. In practice, the next hours can be volatile. Advocates encourage layered safety, changes to routines, lights and locks, a contact tree, and fast reporting if terms are violated. None of those steps guarantee safety, they create friction and time. For most families, that is the best available tool: time. We know from Chapter 1 that officers were called for a welfare check at approximately 6:30 p.m. on Friday, October 17, 2025, and that they found 2 adults deceased inside the residence. We also know investigators reconstructed an entry close to dawn. The distance between those anchors is where a life story sits, and it should be told briefly and plainly. Ava had done what the system asks a person to do: seek relief, document risk, accept limits of the process, and continue caring for her children. There is value in saying that out loud, because cases like this are often mislabeled as "why didn't she leave?" questions. She did leave earlier in life, she did seek help, she did follow the rules. The law moved. Violence moved faster. This project is a true crime record, not a memorial video, but facts have weight. Outside the home, neighbors knew Ava by routine: trash day, mornings with a coffee thermos, late pickups when work ran long. Inside the home, investigators will later note a normal environment: no staged ransack, no signs of a prolonged argument. When violence is brief, rooms look ordinary. That makes the paperwork more important: the order, its date, and any service record become part of the scene because they define context without guesswork. Let me address enforcement plainly. An order is enforceable when a violation happens or is attempted and reported. If a respondent appears at the residence and the protected party calls, officers can arrest. If an intruder enters quietly at 5 a.m., enforcement becomes forensic, not immediate. You prove the violation after the fact with entry damage, digital evidence, and ballistics, not with a cruiser already on the street. In towns like Winchester, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. But police still work from what they can document, not what they suspect. Ava's circle had already started adapting. Family members checked in more often. Friends coordinated rides. Small changes only visible if you knew the schedule. Those details matter because they explain why a welfare check occurs: a missed call, an uncollected item, a pattern that breaks. At 6:30 p.m., someone recognized a break-in pattern big enough to ask for help. That request pulled officers to Westside Drive and set the rest of the case in motion. From an investigative standpoint, the protective order does 3 things for the file. First, it narrows the universe of relevant prior contacts to a legally recognized risk party. Second, it creates a trail, petition, affidavit, date timestamps that can be matched against communications, location data, and any approach attempts. Third, it informs threat assessment. Separation plus a fresh order is a known spike in danger. Those are not narratives, they are working tools. The next chapter will apply them to the room itself, the window, the route, and the pattern of 2 gunshots inside a single-family home. I'll add one thought that belongs in every segment like this. Systems help, but they are not a wall. If you're watching in a situation that resembles this one, use every layer available: orders, safety plans, neighbors, technology, and treat early morning hours as high-risk windows. Viewers who are not in danger still have a role: answer calls, return texts, and be the person who notices when a routine breaks. In the end, many cases start with a small action that bought someone 10 extra minutes. Sometimes, 10 minutes is the difference between a search and a recovery. The scene work starts outside. Investigators begin at the rear of the home because that's where the structure talks first. The window frame at the back shows clear disturbance: hardware out of position, screen displaced, sash no longer snug to its seat. It reads like a point of entry rather than an exit. The path from that window to a rear sleeping area is short and direct: no reason to wander, no signs of rummaging. That matters. When a scene isn't torn apart, detectives look for a focused purpose rather than a search. Inside, the process is methodical. Perimeter secured. Photo grid from white to tight. Evidence markers placed before anything is touched. The floor plan is simple, which helps the team reconstruct movement in minutes rather than hours. You can tell a lot from what isn't there: no overturned furniture, no broken fixtures, no long trail suggesting a fight that moved room to room. The room where violence happened is contained, the rest of the house reads like a normal Friday. That contrast gives the timeline weight. Whatever occurred likely began and ended quickly. The first forensic discovery in this case is basic but decisive. The back window provides a reliable entry narrative. The frame bears marks consistent with forced access. The surrounding surfaces show disturbance in line with an intruder moving inward, not outward. For the file, that's more than a detail, it is the hinge. It converts a welfare check into a homicide scene and narrows who could have been involved to someone willing to defeat a barrier before daylight. From there, attention shifts to the firing sequence. The second discovery is the count and placement of shell casings relative to where two bodies are found. This is a closed residence with no evidence of shots fired from outside. Casings and their spread help set order, a close-range discharge consistent with a fatal head wound in the rear sleeping area, a separate discharge elsewhere inside the home consistent with a self-inflicted injury. No third casing. No missing casing trails. 2 shots total. In a house this quiet, the number matters as much as the distances. It supports the timeline we carry forward, violence initiated and concluded within the same structure before sunrise, discovered in the evening. Ballistic work continues with standard tasks. The weapon is recovered on site and frozen in place until photographed and measured. Trajectory lines are drawn in simple terms, where the muzzle likely sat, where the round traveled, and where material impact occurred. You don't need advanced physics to read the room. You need clean measurements, consistent notes, and restraint. When angles match what the injuries later confirm at autopsy, you've built a foundation that doesn't rely on guesswork or witness memory. That's the point, facts that survive crosscheck. Tech teams move next. Warrants cover phones, a doorbell camera if present, and neighboring devices that sometimes pick up motion at odd hours. The intention is not to stage a digital drama, it's to confirm whether anyone approached the property between roughly 4:45 and 5:15 a.m., whether a vehicle appeared on a nearby street, and whether any sensor recorded a disturbance that aligns with the entry window. In many cases, the absence of data has value. If no vehicle is seen, you infer approach on foot. If motion triggers around the back align with the time detective's already suspect, you strengthen the spine of the case without adding narrative you can't prove. Room conditions offer another quiet confirmation. No heavy odor of cleaning agents, no broad wipe patterns on high-touch surfaces, no post-incident staging that would complicate the timeline. That simplicity is not comfort. It's clarity. A blunt sequence, entry, 1 fatal shot in close quarters, a second discharge elsewhere, allows investigators to focus on who had motive and proximity within a very tight window. The work is cold by necessity, but it is not indifferent. Cases like this are about minutes, and minutes force choices. Doors get reinforced. Children are accounted for. Families start calling when a routine breaks. In towns like Winchester, neighbors notice those breaks faster than people give them credit for. We keep names withheld in this phase because identification belongs to a later chapter in the timeline, after official notification. For now, the elements that move the case forward are locked: a forced entry through the rear window before dawn, 2 discharges inside one address, a weapon recovered in place, and no sign that anyone left to create a second scene. The rest is follow-through, confirmation from Frankfurt, lab matches, and a clean handoff from scene to case detectives. A quick note for those watching who live with protective orders or are considering one: layered safety still matters. Exterior lighting, neighbor contact trees, and consistent check-ins do not stop a determined intruder, but they can trigger faster responses and stronger documentation. If you have the bandwidth, plan those layers this week. If you don't, ask someone to help you build them. It's not a guarantee. It's time, and time is often the deciding factor. Between the predawn entry and the evening welfare check, the case lives or dies on what the clock and the electronics can prove. Detectives start with what is standard but essential: a neighborhood canvas, a pool of dispatch logs, and targeted warrants for devices that might have seen or heard something without anyone realizing it at the time. It's Winchester, Kentucky, not a downtown corridor, so there aren't dozens of cameras on every corner. But these days, a handful of doorbells on a quiet street can cover more ground than you think. Officers move house to house with a short script: "Did you hear anything before sunrise?" Any visitors, engines, or lights where they didn't belong? Most neighbors didn't wake to a gunshot, closed windows, white noise machines, and fall weather keep homes sealed. Still, one resident remembers a motion alert before 5:10 a.m. They didn't check the phone at the time. By evening, the alert is buried under a day's messages. That's common. Investigators request temporary access, and the homeowner consents. The clip doesn't show a face or a vehicle, only a faint movement at the edge of a yard line that runs behind Ava Brantley's address. Not a smoking gun, but it pins activity inside the window detectives are already working with. Doorbells and porch cams only help if their timestamps can be trusted, so the team checks device time against the dispatch server. If a camera's internal clock is off by 3 minutes, they correct for drift. 2 other neighbors don't have cameras but do have security lights with logs. Those logs record triggers at 4:58 a.m. and 5:03 a.m., each lasting under 30 seconds. The lights face the back lots, not the street. The pattern is subtle, but it tracks. Something crossed the rear setbacks, moving with purpose rather than wandering. The data aligned cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. You don't want coincidence to impersonate proof. So they look for one more anchor. Phones are next. With the judge's approval, detectives narrow their request to relevant hours on October 17, 2025, around West Side Drive. They aren't sweeping the city, they're bracketing a few hundred yards for a sliver of time. Historical cell site data never paints a crystal clear on a map, but it can show whether a device with known ties to the address pinged nearby towers before dawn. If a device is powered down, there's nothing to see. If it wakes briefly, that ping becomes a milepost. Investigators also seek Ava's phone records to confirm her last known use the night before. There's no outgoing 911 call and no message sent after midnight. That silence is a fact, not an assumption. It just means whatever happened moved faster than a text. Dispatch fills the other end of the day. The request for a welfare check comes just after 6:30 p.m., flagged to the address by someone who could not reach Ava and recognized that the routine was broken. Patrol arrives, clears the home, and preserves what they find. There is no second address, no chase, no gap that can be filled by rumor. The entire case is contained at one location in Winchester, on a Friday in October, with a time window that begins before the sun rises and ends when officers step through the door that evening. While the tech team processes the devices, detectives return to the rear approach. The ground behind the homes is firm enough that it doesn't hold an obvious impression, but the fence line shows a recent scuff near a spot where a person could swing a leg over. A low limb carries fresh abrasion. None of that proves identity, but it's the kind of detail that lets a jury understand how someone arrived without drawing attention. It also lines up with the lack of vehicle sightings on the street-facing cameras. If no car shows up before dawn, the most likely approach is on foot through the back. There's a human piece to this work that's easy to miss if you only watch the lab gear. The person who called for that evening check did exactly what communities need, noticed a broken routine, didn't overthink it, and asked police to look. In towns like Winchester, that simple act moves the clock. You don't need to be an expert, you just need to pay attention to the people around you. The law handles evidence. Neighbors handle time. By the close of this phase, the story the street is telling is consistent: a pre-dawn approach through the rear setbacks, at least one motion event within minutes of 5 a.m., no vehicle committed to the front curb, and an uninterrupted silence until evening when the welfare check is requested and officers enter. No second scene. No alternate timeline. Just the pieces needed to carry the case into the lab and the medical examiner's suite, where distances and residues will either confirm or challenge what the devices suggest. The day before the killing, a Kentucky judge signed a domestic violence protective order for Ava Brantley. The paperwork is short, the impact is supposed to be simple: no contact, no approach, no presence at the protected address. From an investigative standpoint, that order isn't commentary, it's evidence with timestamps. It tells us a court found recent conduct serious enough to restrict someone's access to Ava and her home on West Side Drive. It also frames the next 24 hours as the riskiest window she would face. Here's how that becomes part of the case file. The petition and the judge's signature lock the date, Thursday, October 16, 2025. If the respondent was served, the proof of service locks the time. Those two stamps matter because any approach after service is not a misunderstanding, it's a violation. Detectives request certified copies from the clerk, then line those records against everything we already established, a likely entry before dawn on Friday, October 17th, and a welfare check that evening. When the law and the timeline overlap by less than a day, you don't need speeches. The sequence speaks for itself. Enforcement of an order depends on what can be proved in real time. If an unwanted party shows up and the protected person calls 911, officers can make an arrest on the spot. If an intruder bypasses locks at 5 a.m. without a noise complaint, enforcement becomes the job of forensics and digital evidence. That is the plain truth viewers deserve. A court order changes leverage, it does not put a patrol car at the curb. It works best when paired with layered safety, lighting, neighbor check-ins, varied routines, and fast reporting of any contact. Those measures don't guarantee safety, but they buy minutes. Minutes are often the difference between a disturbance and a fatal scene. Detectives mind the order for more than timing. The petition usually summarizes recent incidents, dates, places, the kind of contact that led Ava to seek relief. Investigators do not quote private detail on camera, but they do use those entries to guide subpoenas for messages, call logs, and location data around the protected address. If the order explicitly barred contact by phone or text, any message after issuance becomes evidence. If the order listed the residence by street and number, the address itself is a boundary the respondent was on notice to avoid. Those are not abstractions, they are elements a prosecutor can read to a jury without speculation. The next step is service. Was the respondent personally served on the 16th? If yes, at what hour, and by whom? If the order was served late in the day, detectives measure the gap between service and the predawn entry we documented in earlier chapters. If service was pending, the order was still valid, but the knowledge element changes. Investigators then pivot to proof the respondent knew the terms, recorded voicemails referencing the order, messages acknowledging it, or prior contacts that show awareness. This is why the order belongs in the same folder as the doorbell logs and casing markers. It is not a separate relationship chapter. It is a legal context that narrows motive and establishes notice. Police speak candidly about what an order can and cannot do because families need accuracy, not reassurance. The paper creates a chargeable offense for contact. It does not harden a door. That is why advocates teach practical layers, keep exterior lights consistent, move cars to vary patterns, ask neighbors to text when they see anything off, and document every breach, even if it feels small. Those habits aren't paranoia. They are routine, and routine is easier to sustain than fear. In towns like Winchester, the person who notices a broken pattern and calls in a welfare check can save hours. In this case, that call came at about 6:30 p.m., and it brought officers to the only address that matters in this story. For viewers who have asked if orders fail, the answer is more precise than that. Orders succeed when violations are reported early and stopped quickly. They fail when a determined offender moves in the narrowest, quietest slice of the day. The document itself is still vital to accountability. It tells the truth about risk in the system's own language. When detectives place that truth next to a forced window, a close-range fatal shot, and a second discharge inside the same home, the through line is not dramatic. It is linear. The choice to include the order in this narrative is not about blame. It is about giving the public a clear understanding of how cases like this are built. Courts make findings. Police lock scenes. Labs confirm distances and residues. Communities notice breaks in routine and call early. Each part has a role. We don't build myths here. We build sequences we can stand on. Names are released only after family is notified and facts are checked twice. When Winchester police issue their statement, it formalizes what this investigation has been building toward. The woman found inside the West Side Drive home is Ava Brantley, 35. The man found inside the same residence as Tyler Snowden, 38, of Irvine in neighboring Estill County. With those identifications public, the case file moves from scene reconstruction to medical confirmation. The bodies go to Frankfurt, where the state medical examiner handles autopsies for cases like this. The goal is not flourish, it is sequence. Range, trajectory, and residue either match a room story or they don't. Here, they match. The fatal wound to Ava is consistent with a close-range gunshot in the rear sleeping area we've already documented. The second wound, on the male, reads as self-inflicted. That distinction matters because it locks the manner of each death without relying on assumptions about motive. Time of death estimates are always a range, not a timestamp. Based on body temperature, lividity, and scene conditions, the medical findings support what the house and the devices suggested, a predawn incident on Friday, October 17, 2025, hours before the welfare check just after 6:30 p.m. The laboratory does what field teams cannot: confirm soot and stippling at the victim site, compare residue on the male's hands and clothing, and verify that casing placement lines up with the order of shots. There is no sign of a third round. Nothing indicates an exchange of gunfire. The story is brief and decisive: one fatal shot, one self-inflicted shot, inside one address. Ballistics technicians document the firearm and submit it for standard comparison. Ejection patterns and marks on the casings track with where they were found. That alignment is the quiet strength of this file. When each system, scene photos, device logs, autopsy findings, and ballistics, repeats the same sequence independently, a case becomes stable. Viewers don't need the brand of the weapon or the exact grain weight to understand what matters most here. The pattern holds under every test. Identification also brings the legal piece into sharper focus. Because Ava had a domestic violence protective order granted the day before, prosecutors now have a clean line between a court's warning and the conduct that followed. Proof of service, if completed on the 16th, will tighten that link further. Even if service timing was close to the event, recorded messages or references to the order can establish notice. These are not side notes, they are elements a jury can understand in plain language. The court set a boundary, the boundary was crossed, and the outcome is recorded by science rather than opinion. There is a human cost at every stage that doesn't show up in lab tables. Next of kin must be notified. Children must be cared for by people who loved Ava and now inherit her routines. Community groups will frame this case as a call for better safety planning, faster service of orders, or targeted follow-ups the day after a court signs relief. Reasonable people will disagree on policy. What is not in dispute is the sequence inside this home. When violence is this fast, the only honest promise is early detection and rapid response. Neighbors did their part when the pattern broke. Investigators did theirs by refusing to fill gaps with guesses. With identities confirmed and manners determined, homicide for Ava, suicide for Snowden, the file advances to context: what came before the protective order, what risk indicators were already on paper, and how agencies track escalation after separation. That is where the next segment goes, and it stays within the same single thread. One house. One timeline. One ending. Once the identifications are public and the autopsies confirm sequence, detectives turn to paper and databases, the part of a homicide that doesn't make noise but answers critical questions. They pull the protective order packet, prior court dockets tied to the names now on file, and any police contacts logged before October 16, 2025. The aim is straightforward: establish whether the danger to Ava Brentley was recognized by the system before the predawn attack and, if so, how clearly. The protective order issued on October 16 is the first anchor. Investigators verify the exact hour it was granted and whether service was completed that same day. If a deputy or process server recorded personal service, that timestamp becomes legal notice. If service was pending, detectives look for independent proof the respondent knew, messages referencing the order, voicemails acknowledging it, or statements to third parties. This isn't trivia. Notice converts an approach into a criminal violation and strengthens motive built on control and access. Next is the history. Public reporting and court lookups show prior domestic violence involvement tied to the male now identified inside the West Side Drive home. Detectives request certified dispositions and any diversion agreements from earlier in 2025, then lay them beside the order timeline. The pattern they're testing is well known to advocates. Risk tends to spike after separation and right after a court imposes a boundary. In this case, the boundary was drawn on a Thursday. The attack happened before sunrise Friday. That proximity is not used to dramatize the story. It is used to explain why officers, prosecutors, and judges flag fresh orders as high-monitor windows. Phone extractions and messaging subpoenas now have context. If the order barred contact by any means, a single text after issuance becomes evidence. If location sharing was toggled off by Ava near the time of the petition, that change is logged. If the respondent's device pinged near Westside Drive in the predawn window, that data doesn't just place a phone, it corroborates the breach of a boundary the court had just set. The value here isn't speculation about intent, it's a stack of objective points that lead directly into the scene we've already confirmed. Detectives also check for prior calls for service at or near Ava's address in the months before October 17th. If officers responded previously, even for a disturbance without arrest, those CAD entries help prosecutors explain the progression to a jury without leaning on opinion. If there were safety plans in place from advocacy partners, investigators document the date of the last contact. The record shows who did what, when, and how fast. It's accountability, not narrative padding. This is where the human and the legal meet. Ava followed the process available to her: petition, court, order. Friends and family adapted routines and stayed in touch. A welfare check was called when her pattern broke on the evening of October 17, 2025. The system did not miss a mystery, it confronted a timing problem. Orders move on paper immediately, they take time to harden into practical protection. When the gap between a judge's signature and an offender's next move is measured in hours, forensics will always be the tool that tells the truth after the fact. The file emerging from this chapter is clean: a fresh protective order, documented notice, prior DV involvement on record, and device or message evidence aligned to the narrow window before dawn. None of it changes the two-shot sequence inside the home. It explains why that sequence was foreseeable enough to trigger a court order and why, going forward, agencies argue for tighter follow-ups in the first 24 hours after one is signed. When the scene work ended and the names were public, Winchester did what it knows: cover the basics for Ava Brantley's children, set a time to honor her, and clear space for investigators to finish without noise. Nothing here needs embellishment. The facts already carry weight: an order of protection signed on October 16, 2025, a forced entry before dawn on October 17, a welfare check that evening, a two-shot sequence inside one home, autopsies in Frankfurt confirming homicide and suicide. One address. One timeline. One ending. What a town does next matters. Officials and advocates kept the conversation narrow and useful: how to close the gap between a judge's signature and the first 24 hours that follow. Some counties verify service the same day, even after business hours. Others script a next morning welfare knock when an order is fresh. Advocacy teams test automated check-ins, short messages at set times that escalate when there is no reply. None of this guarantees safety. Each step compresses the time it takes to notice trouble. In cases like this, time is the only thing anyone can realistically buy. Neighbors asked what helps most. The answer is ordinary on purpose. Keep a simple text tree for households with active orders so a broken routine triggers one phone call, not a group debate. Make it easy to share doorbell clips with detectives, clear links, clear timestamps. Support lock and lighting programs for families who ask. These aren't heroics, they're default settings that turn attention into response. The work is quieter than a press conference and often more effective. Policy discussions under the Ava's Law banner stay tethered to the record. Proposals focus on faster service verification, short-term heightened checks when lethality indicators exist, and streamlined evidence handoffs so prosecutors can charge order violations without delay. The point is not to rewrite criminal law around a single case, it's to fix the procedural minutes that a determined offender uses. If those minutes shrink, more people get help before a door breaks. Ava's story should not be reduced to the document she needed. But the document still matters, because it proves risk was visible on paper and reminds us where prevention has to concentrate, right after a court draws a line. This channel will never promise that a checklist can stop violence. What we can promise is to tell the truth cleanly and keep the focus on actions that save time, early calls when patterns break, fast service of orders, next day eyes on a door, and tools that make reporting simple. We close with what this investigation established and nothing more. In Winchester, Kentucky, on Friday, October 17, 2025, an ex-boyfriend entered through a back window, shot Ava Brentley at close range, and died by his own hand inside the same residence. The protective order granted the day before defines notice, forensics and autopsies define sequence, community response defines what changes next. If there's meaning to take from a hard file like this, it's practical. Know the routines that keep the people around you safe, and be the person who notices when one breaks. I'm leaving this case with one promise: tell the truth early and act faster. Orders help, but neighbors, routines, and quick calls save minutes, and minutes change outcomes. If you're living with fear, you're not alone. Reach for help, make a plan, and let someone you trust know you're normal. If you're that trusted person, notice the silence and check in. Which safeguard would you push for first: faster order service, a next morning welfare knock, or automated check-ins? If this story moved you, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to follow the next case.